Yes, we're starting. Yes, greetings. Welcome, greetings. As Director of the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, it is truly my great pleasure and honor to welcome all of you today. I am truly delighted to be moderating the launching of CIL Dialogues, our new blog. And which we describe in our blog vision statement as the reimagination of the existing blog for the Center for International Law, CIL. CIL is a Singapore-based research center devoted to research and teaching of international law in Singapore, Asia, and around the world. From our perch in Asia, we aim to reach out to the world to engage in meaningful dialogues on various issues concerning international law, particularly among the different regions, traditions, and disciplines. So to kick off this bold vision today, we have an absolutely star-studded group headed by the international law legend, professor and ambassador at large for Singapore, the one and only Tommy Ko, together with our brilliant editorial team for CIL Dialogues. So very briefly, if I can, for Tommy Ko, he has so many achievements, it's really impossible to give them very short. But he was Singapore's permanent representative at the UN, president of the Law of the Sea Conference, the third one, chair of the Rio Conference on the Environment Preparatory Committee, one of the drafters or fathers of the ASEAN Charter. He led the negotiations for the United States-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. And that is why he's also the recipient in 2014 of the Great Negotiator Award from the Harvard Law School, and much, much more. So I'm going to have to stop here. We don't have time. But I have to add one thing, most important in my view, is that he's one of the founders and visionaries of the Center for International Law here. And he's currently chair of our International Advisory Panel and former chair of the governing board. Now for the brilliant team that will lead CIL Dialogues, forgive me, but I'm going to be brief on your introductions, but suffice it to say that each and every one of them are highly accomplished and recognized international scholars, which is why they have been invited to lead CIL Dialogues. And you can learn more about them from our website. But first, Martins Paperinskis. He is the editor-in-chief of CIL Dialogues and professor at University of College London, Faculty of Law, and also a member-elect to the International Law Commission. Professor Wei Lei Chia, associate professor at the Faculty of Law of the National University of Singapore, and of course, editors. Dina Zuvala, also one of our editors at CIL Dialogues, who is associate professor at Australian National University College of Law. Massimo Lando, an editor, who is assistant professor at the City University of Hong Kong. Our own Sien Lee Tan, who is heading our ASEAN Law and Policy program at CIL, but she's also assistant professor at NUS Law School. And last but not least, Yvette Fu, who is the managing editor of CIL Dialogues and a research assistant at CIL. So let's go on. What we're going to do is have a round table, and I'm going to start off with some questions to Tommy. But of course, as a round table, I invite the editors also to feel free to chime in with views or comments. So Tommy, my first question is that in one of your writings, you said that several of your leaders once told you that there is no such thing as international law. And I think many of us in international law have heard this. So I'd like to know, how did you respond to this denial of this field of international law? Do you think you were successful in convincing them?
There's a lot of skepticism in the world on international law, on its efficacy and so on. But there was a time in Singapore when the skeptics include the president of the country and the Chief Justice. So I was taken aback when both of them said to me that there was no such thing as international law. And I had to be very, very polite in my response, you know. So I said, Singapore had 2 cases in recent years, one in the International Court of Justice at The Hague, and one at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And I asked them, what law do you think the court and the tribunal applied in deciding those cases? They couldn't answer my question. So I said, well, the law they applied is international law, you know? And I said to them that international law pervades many aspects of our lives. When you make a mobile phone to somebody in another country, it is transmitted by satellite. And there's a system of satellites in space occupying places which are allocated to it by the International Telecommunication Union. And there's a law applicable to space. You know, when you order something on Amazon and comes by ship, the safety of navigation is also regulated by international law. So in this very gentle way, I try to explain to these 2 important leaders that international law does exist. It may not be comparable to domestic law, but there's no question but that international law exists.
Well, I think that was an absolutely brilliant response you gave. And I think part of the issue is that people confuse enforcement issues with the concept of international law and don't understand. And I think you really explained it so clearly, how it's actually regulating, you know, the behavior of different states, different entities. So do you think they were convinced?
I don't know whether they're convinced, but at least they stopped saying that international law doesn't exist.
Okay, I think you convinced them then. I don't know if anyone wants to add in any experience that any of you have had. Yeah, Dina.
Thank you, Professor. It's interesting that we have to have these discussions with everyone from undergrads to heads of states, right? I'm currently teaching 2nd year undergrads international law. It's a compulsory course in my university, which is great, but you get the same skepticism. And what I try to tell them sometimes is, first, that is not comparable, as you said, to domestic law, but also to an extent is not comparable to a myth we have about domestic law, right? That it happens in the courts, and that is where all law happens, right? Whereas I feel, for example, for a very long time, people like social legal scholars have been, law also happens in bureaucracies, they happens in the street if you have an encounter with the police, it happens in so many places that don't actually rely on court decisions, right? And I think I almost try to tell them, what if international law is both different, but at the same time, it's also a way for you to start thinking of law differently, start thinking of law as something that may be happening in courts, and that's definitely part of the story, but it might be happening, as you said, even like in the logistics chain, when our stuff gets from one place to the other. Right. I don't know if it works, but I try to almost persuade them, what would your legal studies be like if you treated international law as the paradigm, right, and you rethought all law based on that? I think very few buy it, but I think I'll keep trying.
Very good.
Thank you.
Yeah, the invisible hand of international law. Martins.
Right. Well, Professor Ko, it was a great pleasure of hearing this exchange. I mean, I think on the existence of international law, I mean, one has to mention at some point the possibly apocryphal but much retold explanation by Ian Brownlee at an Oxford dinner, who supposedly in response to a question by one of his dining companions said, "Have you seen my bank account?" So, probably the serious way of making the point would be that serious actors within the international community, states and others, do take it seriously. So if the serious people take it seriously, it must be something more than a legal charade. And incidentally, I have to say, even though probably from methodologically completely different standpoints, I arrive at precisely the same point as Dina, that to think that domestic law happens in bailiffs' offices and courts is to utterly mischaracterize the legal dynamic. Although, of course, it's understandable for the purposes of simplicity of isolating one newspaper front page issue and managing the entirety of expectations against it. It's simpler, but it is much, much less accurate.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think this kind of may bring me into the second question in terms of, I mean, the point is the role of international law. And of course, many people, unless you're in international, don't really understand it. But we're now in a situation, and this is first the question is to Tommy, Russia, President Putin, invaded Ukraine back in February, the 24th of February, and in clear violation of the UN Charter and international law. And this was recognized under a resolution that was voted by some 164 states. But the international community's inability to deter and punish such aggression, has it increased skepticism about the usefulness or even, can we say, existence of international law? How do you react to that? How do you respond to that?
Yes, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one of my very good friends said to me, what's the use of having international law when you are unable to deter Russia from invading Ukraine and you're unable to punish Russia for having violated international law? I had to acknowledge that, yes, it is a weakness of international law that we are unable to enforce. You know, one of the weaknesses of international law is that you're not able to enforce, you're not able to demand compliance. And it's also true that if you look at the records of all the great powers, all of them have a very checkered record. No one has been has a perfect record of complying with the law when there are important national interests at stake. Very often they take the law into their own hands. You know, I remember President Clinton once said that the United States will always pursue its national interest, if possible, in compliance with international law, and if necessary, on its own. This really represents the view of the great powers. But I want to point out to the skeptics that while we can't prevent great powers from using force, from invading other countries, they do not succeed, you know. Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1978. It had to withdraw its forces from Cambodia in 1991. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. 10 years later, the Soviet Union withdrew its forces from Afghanistan. The United States invaded Grenada in 1983, and the United States withdrew from Grenada. So, yes, you're temporarily successful. You invade another country, overthrow its government, you impose a government of your choice. But in the longer run, most of these countries do not succeed. And I am waiting to see whether or not Russia succeeds. You know, I hope Russia doesn't succeed, because I think that President Putin's objective now is to retain Crimea and to acquire what you call Donbass, the two so-called new republics. I hope he doesn't succeed. I hope Ukraine succeed. And even if in the short run, Russia succeed, going by precedent, I'm confident that in the longer run, Russia will not succeed. But I have to acknowledge that the international community had no way to deter the great powers from violating international law and punishing them, because the Security Council is structured in such a way that the 5 great powers have permanent seats and a power of veto. So any one of them can use the power of veto to block action against them when they are the accused. You know, it's a weakness of the system, and we have to be frank and acknowledge that it's a weakness of the system.
Yeah, I think, Tommy, I mean, the Russian, of course, it's not the first time, and you're right that a big power has violated international law. But it does raise issues, and I think that these are big questions. The UN Security Council, the whole structure of the post World War II UN Charter system, the way it is, and whether now its dysfunction is really something that, which kind of will come, I think, to our topic about, how international law is shaping up. But one thing that did strike me when the General Assembly met under the emergency resolution for United for Peace, and international law was front and center in practically every statement. And so the question is, if we didn't have international law, what would be, for all its imperfections, and I think domestic law, and Nadina was talking, was also, we can't say domestic law is able to succeed in ensuring, crime-free or everything's working smoothly. Right. But you did have international law really at the center. So there's a lot of issues, but I want to hear more from our editors. Any comments? These are, yes, Wei Ling, please.
I wanted to maybe add on and support Professor Koh's observations that perhaps when you look at international law's effectivity, a longer time span is required, because even in the case of Ukraine, the ICC prosecutor has opened investigations into the situation, and there's a lot of discussions among countries on how accountability for atrocities occurring there can be brought to bear, and the different mechanisms that can be used, not just the ICC, but national prosecutions and cooperative efforts. So I think that if you take a longer view, you can see that international law has a very real effect on influencing how things evolve, even in a conflict situation.
Yeah, but the tragedy is that all the great powers have refused to become party to the Statute of Rome, Treaty of Rome. They don't want to be subject to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Although in the case of Ukraine, the ICC feels that it has jurisdiction, and it is investigating allegations of crimes against humanity and other crimes by Russia. But this is one of the ugly realities of our world, right? The big powers, the United States, Russia, China, even France and UK have not joined the Treaty of Rome. Why? Because they feel that they may be using their armed forces against another country, and they don't want their military personnel to be liable to prosecution by ICC. We haven't arrived at a consensus at the international level that no one should be above the law and everyone should be accountable. I think we haven't achieved that. Yeah.
Massimo. Sorry. Please go ahead, Tommy. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Nilofer, and thank you, Professor Koh. I suppose that I am a bit of a fan of the idea that history tends to repeat itself in cycles, after all. Now, of course, we have the issue of Ukraine at the moment, the war in Ukraine, which is probably a very low point of international law in the last few years. But if you actually look at a few years before the Ukrainian invasion by Russia, we had Brexit, we had the statements by President Trump concerning the role of international law from the United States perspective and so on. So it seems like it goes in ebbs and flows in a way. And because we're at such a low point at the moment with the invasion of Ukraine, one at least hopes that there's going to be an upward trajectory at some point. Now, of course, we're coming to the point when it's been nearly 80 years since the end of the Second World War, 1945, well, it's 78 years ago. I imagine that a lot of people have a very short memory, unfortunately, and what were the fundamental tenets of what was the world order that came out of the 1945 UN Charter has been perceived in a different way, but people that have a different sensitivity from those that actually went through the horrors of what was that time. So of course there are pros and cons to that situation, because you have a potential upward trajectory, but people with a short memory span, unfortunately. So that's what CIL Dialogues is here to do, I suppose, criticize what's happening and thinking about the potential trajectories that international law can take from now on.
Yeah. It's a different world. Dina.
Thank you, Professor Ko, and thank you, Massimo. I actually wanted to pick up from where Massimo left it. And to me, something that seems at least valuable in this moment, that seems a moment of despair, is a bit like Massimo implied, that I think the legal evil of aggression as such is coming again to the forefront, right? Because as we know, aggression was not part of the original crimes and the Rome Statute. And I think for a very long time, there was such a focus on atrocity in war, while war as such, both in international criminal law, but also to an extent in jus ad bellum with expansive interpretation and all these things, had been sidelined. And I think there's something valuable that even in this ad hoc way, and maybe perhaps because it's Russia and not some other of the usual suspects, we are talking again about crimes against peace as the crime of crimes, in the way that it was actually framed in Nuremberg, in the way that it's from that crime that the other crimes against humanity and genocide flow. So I don't know if that will go somewhere, but I feel putting again on center of the table of international law crimes against peace and aggression as a harm and an evil in its own right. I think it is bringing in the discussion things that perhaps had gone missing in the past 20, 30 years, with the promise that war had become humane and very tech savvy and all these things. So that would be perhaps for me one tiny glimpse of hope, because also I think it matters that international law governs things, but I think also it matters what international law focuses on. Thank you.
Martins?
Thank you. And I think really in agreement with all the great points that were made. And I think that one thing, and that perhaps also inches ever more closely to what we think at CIL Dialogues would be about, of exploring the tensions between the regional and universal perspectives that may be shared and may be different. So from the Eastern European perspective, and I suppose particularly from statehood of Baltic states perspective, I think that there is sympathy, I suppose, for the normative proposition that in the long term international law prevails, at the same time acceptance that the long time may be very long indeed. 50 years in this case.
Yeah.
So I suppose reasonable people might disagree whether that is, in terms of efficacy, having to wait for 3 generations is in line with the promise. But I guess, and it also probably looks at the perspective a bit differently in different regions, because one might say, from the broader Eastern European perspective, actually the fact that these are things that are the political center of international legal argument, that are being debated in the General Assembly, or that are being debated in Security Council and Human Rights Council, is a very vivid contrast with the way how essentially various uses of force and suppression of self-determination were being debated about Eastern Europe throughout the Cold War, where, to borrow from Koskiniemi, I think the plausible general take would be that Kremlin is not a court of law. And, the closest that the ICJ might get to it is to acknowledge that you can't really constitute an arbitral tribunal out of thin air. So in that perspective, that is certainly a much greater involvement by the international community. So I suppose of the sense of the variety, sometimes divergence, sometimes overlap of regional perspectives is, I think, one point that strikes me as very interesting here.
Can I make another point?
Yes.
I want to make a provocative point and say that we are living through a difficult period of history. I think I see a decline in support for multilateralism, and I see an increase in the propensity by great power to resort to unilateralism. So I see this as a threat to world order, that a decrease in support for multilateralism and a greater propensity by those who can to resort to unilateralism. So I feel anxious about the period we're living through.
And Tommy, I have to say that I know that for Singapore, the international legal order, international law is especially important as a small country. And you just did your book launch yesterday, really bringing together small states. And of course, when it's the big powers at the table, what happens to the small states? And that really can be destabilizing.
Yeah.
So I think the point is well taken. I see Sian Lee, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on, the first question to Prof. Koh and what you mentioned about your colleague who said, what's the use of international law? And then bringing it back to what we just discussed about the state of the world now. So for policymakers, for practitioners of international law, not just scholars, international law is a new problem, a new old problem. So for policymakers and practitioners, how would you encourage the community to take international law seriously? Because if we're looking at Asia and the ASEAN region, what I've observed is that international law has become increasingly important in the last 10 to 20 years. But now with, international law in disarray, it might bring us back to skepticism of putting law into action. And that is greatly destabilizing on top of what is happening.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to the issue of now we come to the region. And I think you made a striking comment, Sian Lee, that international law is in disarray. Is it? One thing that is interesting before I get to the follow-up question, despite this, it does seem though that states still hang on to international law. And for example, it's really interesting, the advisory opinion on genocide, and now the latest is Germany. So I don't know how many states now have basically signed up for that. So clearly the states see a role for international law, in this case, an advisory opinion at the ICJ that was initiated. I mean, it's really interesting. And I understand, and Wei Ling, I think this is coming to something you said, Ukraine actually is preparing very much for ICC and also environmental issues as well. So clearly Ukraine does have some, confidence that international law will come in. But having said that, let's turn to Asia, because I think one important, from the center's perspective, and I know, Tommy, how the center was established, and looking at international law that always seems to have a very heavy Western accent to it. And we're talking about dispute resolution. So I understand that in Asia, it's not, the type of going to court, dispute resolution that the West has is really not part of Asian cultures. There's a reluctance to take a friend to court. So if negotiations fail within the international, and we know even within ASEAN, we can see that. How do you convince, is it possible to convince Asian cultures that third-party dispute settlement is not wrong, that you can go to international courts such as Singapore and Malaysia did?
I think there's a cultural divide between Northeast Asia and the rest of Asia. In Southeast Asia and South Asia, I think we have accepted what began as a Western norm, that if we can't solve a dispute through negotiations, it is not wrong. In fact, it's a good thing to refer the dispute to a binding third party. You see this in the behavior of Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and so on, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. In Northeast Asia, however, you have a different culture. In China, in Japan, and South Korea, where I think the Confucian tradition is stronger, there's a reluctance to take a friend to court. You know, the feeling is that we should try to solve our problem through negotiation, through mediation, through conciliation. And it is remarkable that China, Japan, and South Korea have judges either in the International Court of Justice or the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, or both, and yet none of the three countries has ever taken the initiative to bring another country with which it has a dispute to a third party. So I told my Japanese friends that since you're so convinced that you're a superior case over 钓鱼, why don't you take China to the International Court of Justice? And the Japanese response is that we don't acknowledge there's a dispute, you know? So they're not even to acknowledge that they have a dispute with China over Senkaku 钓鱼. And the same in the dispute between Japan and South Korea over a rock, which the Japanese call Takashima and the South Koreans say Dokdo. South Korea is in possession of it. The Japanese told South Korea, let's refer this dispute to ICJ. And guess what? The Korean response is, there's no dispute. What are you talking about? So the tendency in Northeast Asia, in China, Japan, and South Korea is that they are not even willing to acknowledge that there's a legitimate dispute with another party. Whereas in Southeast Asia, we are much more pragmatic, you know. So I was once invited by this South Korean to speak at a conference in Seoul on what can Northeast Asia learn from Southeast Asia regarding the resolution of territorial disputes. And I told them the story about Petrobangka. I said, for hundreds of years, Singapore was in possession of Petrobangka, but in 1979, Malaysia made a claim against it. We think Malaysian claim is not meritorious, but nevertheless, the Malaysians said, no, we own this island. And when negotiations failed, it was Singapore that took the initiative to tell Malaysia, why don't we refer this dispute to ICJ, you know? So I told the Japanese and the South Korean, why don't you follow our example? And they say, this is just completely unacceptable. They say, what if they were to lose the case, you know? I say, yeah, in the case of Singapore too, when we agreed to refer the dispute to ICJ, we took a risk that ICJ may actually find against her. But we're willing to take the risk because we want good relations with our neighbor. We don't want this dispute to contaminate the whole bilateral relationship, you know. But politically, this is not acceptable in China, Japan, and South Korea. So my conclusion is that culturally, there's a difference between Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. That somehow we are the products of a different cultural box, and we have a different mindset, a different attitude.
Yeah, that's really, yeah, that detail is really interesting, Tom, because I'm also thinking you were president of the Law of the Sea Conference, and obviously the convention, compulsory dispute settlement, is one of the key components of the package deal. And as you noted, you have judges from those countries. So how, during the negotiations, did this come up? I mean, how did it reflect during the negotiations where in the sense of, I'm sorry, let me gather my thoughts. Was there ever a proposal to bring in an alternative way that would have reflected perhaps that Northeast Asian thinking?
Yes, we inserted as one of the modalities of dispute settlement, conciliation.
Ah.
You see, and conciliation is not a win-loss, but a win-win outcome, you know? And I'm so pleased that Timor-Leste took Australia to compulsory conciliation over the dispute in the Timor Sea. And I think we are very lucky that this first case of compulsory conciliation was successful. And as you know, we have a book. I want to do a book on this case because I want the whole world to know that if you don't like taking another country to arbitration or adjudication, there's this other procedure called conciliation. And it is not adversarial. It is a win-win outcome. So my appeal to China and Japan and South Korea is, do think about conciliation when the circumstances are appropriate. You know, not every case is appropriate, but where the circumstances are appropriate, think about conciliation.
Wei Ling.
Thank you so much for that very interesting description of what happened, Professor Koh. I was wondering, right, based on your experience, I mean, so this is a great example of how international law has evolved to accommodate different dispute resolution mechanisms that reflects perhaps different cultural approaches to dispute resolution. I was wondering, to what extent do you think international law can accommodate such different traditions or different approaches? And in particular, those that come from countries that are less powerful, because Northeast Asia, countries like China, they are pretty powerful. And then this probably builds on observations that Prof. Koh made as well as Sian Lee made. How do we make countries, less powerful countries like ASEAN countries or smaller states, countries that have now a faith in international law, but how do we build on these gains, right? And to make sure that their voices and positions are actually reflected and taken into account.
But it's not so simple, Wei Ling. Let's look at a concrete case. In 2014, the Philippines, acting in accordance with UNCLOS, filed legal proceedings against China and took China to arbitration over their dispute in the South China Sea. Philippines was entitled to do this. It need not seek China's consent because China's consent was given when China became a party to UNCLOS. But our Chinese friends refused to participate. China claimed that it had not consented and that China's consent was necessary. China's position, of course, is wrong legally, because when China became a party, China had given its consent. So when Malaysia took Singapore to arbitration, without first asking our consent, we agreed to participate because we knew that Malaysia had the right to do so, and we are obliged to accept Malaysia's request for us to take part in arbitration. But China wouldn't play by the rules, you see. China wouldn't take part in the arbitration. And when the Arbitral Tribunal gave its award in 2016, the Chinese have rubbished this award and said it's inconsistent with international law. And worse, it conducted a smear campaign against the 5 distinguished international lawyers who constituted the Arbitral Tribunal. So my question is, what can the ASEAN country do in the face of China's behavior?
Massimo.
One point that struck me earlier on that Professor Ko made was about Southeast Asian pragmatism when approaching dispute settlement. And I wondered at that moment whether maybe it's also a sector-dependent pragmatism in a way. Now, I'm reminded actually of the way that disputes are settled within the ASEAN context, for example. I don't think there's any, and Xian Li might be disagreeing with me on this, but I don't think there's any state-to-state issue that the dispute that ever came in front of a panel under an ASEAN free trade agreement. So instead, what they do is to implement what they call the ASEAN way, this idea of flexibility and resolving disputes through negotiation instead of going to dispute settlement through a binding third party. So perhaps the remarks by Professor Ko might be tempered a little bit also by taking into account the differences between different branches of international law. Perhaps that's what happens in general international law in a way. We took our neighbor to a dispute settlement body because we oblige our obligations and so on. But when it comes to other issues instead, trade, for example, we rather negotiate than to risk it.
Interesting. Martins.
I think that these are absolutely fascinating discussions, and Professor Ko's insight is, of course, stellar. And I think that many of these things are probably not monocausal, that there are cultural assumptions, institutional assumptions, or lack of institutional assumptions. And I think, as Massimo said, also sector specific. I'm reminded, I think it was a quip by the always provocative Jose Alvarez, who once said that China is identical in its attitude to international dispute settlement to United States. Courts for money, no courts for anything else. So that there is really nothing to shine between them. And I think that is one way, I suppose, of slicing the puzzle of the otherwise strong support for dispute settlement, it seems to me, within the World Trade Organization, as well as within investor state dispute settlement bodies, and contrast with that discussion. And I think probably the other point that struck me was that it's often quite likely that there will not be a shared interest for both parties to settle a dispute in a particular manner. It seems entirely natural for the comparatively weaker actor to try to formalize or multilateralize the dispute as much as possible. So it's not surprising at all that it is Philippines, Nicaragua, Mauritius, Palestine that seeks to go to courts in one way or the other, while the comparatively greater powers in different regional settings try to move back to the bilateral negotiation setting where their power differentials would matter more, which I think, again, is sort of the CIL dialogues point, the interesting tension between things that are explicable by the regional lens and things that are explicable by the universal one. Thank you.
Yeah, I see the multidimensional aspects. Dina.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up from what Martins was saying, and I can see Professor Douglas Guilfoyle on the line. And one of the things that he says, especially about the South China Sea arbitration, is maybe we misunderstand the role of international law when we say, but China hasn't backed down. Maybe the truly valuable thing that international law has done is that the Philippines has not backed down. Being that the weaker party, armed with obviously favorable decision, has insisted on the conflict instead of settling, even though even at some point in domestic scene, it did seem that the previous president wanted to settle. So, but Professor Guilfoyle tends to think maybe we are asking the wrong question about where the effectiveness of international law lies. And of course, it doesn't lie in making China or any big power lying down, but arming, as Martins would say, giving one more argument to the weaker actor to continue as much as possible, standing their ground literally and metaphorically. And I also wanted to ask Professor Ko and all of you basically a question. To what extent do you think we are moving towards regional international orders, but not in the sense that Wai Ling was saying, you know, accommodating of difference, but rather fragmenting into big powers and their zones of influence once again. And I'm thinking, for example, of the work Professor Orford has done in that respect. Do you think we're seeing a revival of regionalism, but as great power regionalism? I don't know. That would be my question to Professor Ko and to everyone.
Yeah.
Can I just complete the story about the China-Philippine arbitration?
Sure.
The arbitral tribunal gave its award in 2016. China's reaction is not only to reject the award, but to take actions to punish the Philippines. So it prevented Philippine exports from entering the Chinese market. It stopped sending Chinese tourists to visit the Philippines. It, of course, discouraged Chinese companies from investing in the Philippines. So the Philippines suffered economic loss, you know. So when President Aquino was succeeded by President Duterte decided not to press China to comply with the award. He put it on the side because his agenda was to promote trade and investment with China. But during his 6 years, he didn't get as much as he wanted from China in terms of investment, in terms of trade. And so towards the end of his 6-year tenure, he was a bit disillusioned and he started reviving the arbitral award. And now we have another president, President Marcos, who has appointed as his foreign secretary a very experienced diplomat. And my sense is that under President Marcos, they would rely much more on law than President Duterte did, and they will bring back the 2016 arbitral award and request China in a very polite way to take this into account, you know. So this is an example of the gap between law and power. You may win an arbitral award, but if the more powerful country refuses to comply, and worse, takes punitive action against you to punish you, what can you do? I'm ashamed to say the other ASEAN country did not support the Philippines, you know. And I think the Filipino felt very disappointed that the other 9 ASEAN countries did not rally to the Philippine support, but you know, but it's one of the facts of life that great powers like China have tremendous influence. They're both positive power and negative power, and countries have a lot of stake in good relations to China, so they're reluctant to offend China. You know, on whether we are seeing the emergence of a regional order, I don't think so. You know, and I would make a warning here that proponents of regional power preach a very dangerous gospel. There are some people who say Asia for Asians. The non-Asians should get out of the region. There are some Asians who say disputes between Asians should be settled in Asia. We shouldn't take them to ICJ or WTO. The smaller countries in the region don't agree with it. The smaller countries in the region say, Asia is open to the world, we're part of the world. We want to build an equitable world order that encompasses the region. We don't want to build a regional order which is different from the world order. And we don't agree that Asia is only for Asians because many external powers have a stake in our region. We also don't agree that dispute between Asians should be settled in Asia. And when I was drafting the ASEAN Charter and encountered this argument, and I pointed out to my ASEAN brothers and sisters the example that Singapore and Malaysia are both members of WTO. So when we had a trade dispute and negotiation between us failed, Singapore applied to WTO to compose a dispute panel to look into the dispute. And by doing so, it put pressure on the Malaysians to return to the negotiating table and settle the problem bilaterally with us. In another case, there was this dispute between Singapore and Indonesia over the alleged dumping of toxic waste in an Indonesian island close to Singapore, Batam. And Indonesia wrote to the Secretariat in Geneva of the Basel Convention. This opens a door for Singapore to say to the Secretariat in Geneva, please send an inspection team to Batam to look at the waste and verify whether it's toxic or not. So the Secretariat of the Basel Convention went to Batam to investigate, and they reported that the waste dumped by a Singapore company in Batam was not toxic and therefore not a violation of the Basel Convention. But this is the ASEAN spirit. But as an act of goodwill to Indonesia and in the spirit of ASEAN solidarity, we persuaded our company to take back the waste, even though it was not toxic and not a violation of the Basel Convention. So this is how we settle dispute within the family, you know? So we don't settle dispute exclusively by using our dispute settlement mechanism. We use international dispute mechanism, but there's a certain spirit within the ASEAN family of give and take, of avoidance of conflict. And so when we pressured Malaysia, Malaysia withdrew an anti-Singapore trade measure that was a violation of WTO law. But if we had not taken Malaysia to the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, Malaysia wouldn't have done that, you know. In the same way, when Indonesia informed the Secretariat of the Basel Convention of their complaint against Singapore, this opens a door for us to say, please, why don't we ask the Secretariat to investigate and find out what the facts are, you know.
Sian Lee, oh, there, okay, there you are. Unmute, yeah.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on Dina's question and also a point that Prof. Koh made. So what Professor Orford said about, you know, two regionalisms and about, you know, the China and the US trying to divide kind of well, two sides of the international legal order. I think a lot has been lost. So that may be true. So that's what the powers are trying to do. But then where the voice is lost is the voices of the global South, who China and US are trying to engage. And as Prof. Koh has said, yes, we do not want to make the big powers angry, but we also care very much about the well-being and the interests of our country, right? And so if we're not getting anywhere in kind of the big power relationship, I think small countries do push back, not just the Philippines, but I think very much in the region and in the wider Asia Pacific, there is greater pushback. So I guess Asian states are not really, you know, it's either one or the other or trying to balance one or the other off, but they're also very concerned increasingly in the contemporary world legal order that, hey, we have our rightful place here and don't push us around.
Massimo, and I should say we're 5 minutes into our hour, but maybe we can go 5 minutes over. Is that okay with everyone? An extra 5 minutes? Okay, Massimo.
Thank you, Nilofer. Going to Dina's question on regionalism. Now, I wonder whether there is some sort of virtuous regionalism as well, not just a negative kind. Of course, we have the negative kind, you know, the disputes about Asian countries to be settled in Asia, for example, the way that China or the United States are pushing certain agendas right now. But of course, we also have some sort of multilateralization of regionalism. We have these regional organizations like ASEAN, of course, in trade, think about the Council of Europe or the Organization of American States. They're doing some really good work, of course, for the protection of human rights and furthering of trade. So I guess that there is a degree to which some regionalism is actually not all that bad, if seen in the context of regional international organizations, much in a way in which the ICC works on complementarity. So long as the domestic prosecutors do what they have to do, the ICC doesn't have to do anything. So long as the regions, in a way, do their own part in keeping world order as a peaceful one, then in a way that takes away something from the plate of the United Nations to do anything, or from any other global organizations to come in and have to act where the regional organizations instead fail.
Martins, I think you had, and
so I think Massimo really covered about 90% of the point. I think the term that I was thinking about is that of subsidiarity, the idea that in institutional terms we should locate the issue at just the right level, and that there is sometimes a perfectly good reason to say that there are regional institutions that are responsive to the region's needs. As in the organizations that Massimo mentioned, Council of Europe is not the same as the African Union, not the same as the Organization of American States or ASEAN. And, there are also states that are not part of any of them. And that's, I think, broadly speaking, it seems to me, capital letters, a good thing that they are attuned to slightly different challenges and solutions, as long as, of course, as they are broadly in line with the bigger universal solutions. And I think mostly they are. I mean, Dina's questions is unsurprisingly a very hard one. And I was reminded, I think, that it was von Lowe's Hague Academy lecture a few years ago when he spoke about language and international law, and that sometimes international law consciously refrains from articulating in legal terms some things that could, in principle, be articulated in legal terms. And it was precisely the sort of the zones of influence idea of whether the question for international law is whether the modern Monroe Doctrine, Brezhnev Doctrine may be generated if there's enough support by the more powerful actors, or whether it is so fundamentally inconsistent with the constitutional foundations of current international legal order that law consciously refrains from articulating political impulses in legal terms. So again, perhaps a conscious silence, non-engagement in dialogue sometimes being the right answer.
Niloufar, maybe I could say a few words about ASEAN.
yes, absolutely, Tommy.
ASEAN is 55 years old this year, born in 1967. I'm a very strong believer and a champion of ASEAN. But I'm also clear-eyed about what it has achieved and what it has not achieved. The most important achievement of ASEAN, as in the case of the European Union, is that it's kept the peace in the region. That, to me, is the most important achievement of ASEAN. It's kept the peace in Southeast Asia for 55 years. The second most important achievement of ASEAN is that it has been able to bring together 10 disparate economies into a single economy. We haven't gone as far as the European Union has done, but we are well on the way, We are well on the way to creating in Southeast Asia a single economy, single market, and a production platform. That, I think, is a very considerable achievement. The third important achievement is that within ASEAN, we have created a certain spirit, a certain attitude that we try to avoid disputes. And when disputes arise, we will try in the ASEAN way to accommodate each other's interests and find a consensus. And if we can't find a consensus, we'll defer this to a future day. We also have a spirit of give and take, So if somebody has a very strong position on an issue, we don't isolate the country, we don't pressure it, but we give it time to adjust and conform to the rest. So this is the ASEAN spirit, which is so valuable, no? And I think if you look at the whole developing world, we are the only regional organization that has the stature and credibility to attract to our annual meeting the representatives of the most important countries and regional organizations in the world. I think in Phnom Penh recently, when our ASEAN foreign minister met, the foreign ministers of all the major countries were in Phnom Penh. So all these are the most important achievements of ASEAN. But our integration process has not gone as far as the European integration project, and never will, in my view, never will. We will never have an ASEAN parliament. We will never have an ASEAN Court of Justice. We will never have a single currency. That is too far for us. I think that in Southeast Asia, we're dealing with relatively new countries where sovereignty is still a very important issue. And we haven't reached a point when the member states are willing to pool their sovereignty and for the Secretariat to act on our behalf. We haven't reached that point, and I don't see it within the near future, you know. Another weakness in ASEAN is our dispute settlement mechanisms are immature. And countries don't yet have enough confidence in them to refer dispute to the ASEAN mechanism rather than take it to the ICJ or ICLOS or WTO. I hope in time to come, there will be confidence in our own dispute settlement mechanism under, for example, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which has never been used, you know. So when I ask myself, why do we not use it? I said, because we do not yet have enough confidence in these institutions, which have never been tested, you know. So I mean, those are my concluding remarks, but I just want to say that ASEAN dilemma is we are now faced with two great powers which are engaged in a very intensive rivalry.
Yeah.
And we are under great pressure from both China and the United States to take their side against the other. And ASEAN's contribution is that we are united and we are neutral. We wish to remain friends of both countries. We try to bring them together to sit with one another, to find common cause and to work together. But for the time being, we are not successful because the two countries are on a collision course and determined to confront each other rather than to talk to each other. So the immediate prospects for peace in our region are not good. And I fear actually that the two great countries may inadvertently clash over a hot flashpoint like Taiwan, you know. And there's so little that ASEAN can do to restrain them and to tell them that please don't go down this road. That remember World War I. Nobody wanted to make war, but a war ensued. And this could happen in Asia over Taiwan.
So, Tommy, you made your concluding comments, leaving us with the prospect of a potential war in the region and international law. Wei Ling, I see your hand up, but before I give the floor to you, I'm going to give us a little more time because I do want us to wrap up. This is our launching.
I have to leave you soon because I have a weekly date with my 3 grandchildren.
I know, they take precedence. All right, I just want to give the editors and editor-in-chief final word because we've had an absolutely rich dialogue right now. But in terms of CIL dialogues, tie this all in 10 words or less. But Wei Ling, make your statement if you could just also say a few words about where we're going with CIL dialogues. And I feel like there's so much more we could talk about, frankly.
All right, so when it comes to, we've talked a lot about international law's effectiveness, inclusivity, with respect to small states and less powerful states. But I just wanted to say that, and this is also with respect to CIL dialogue, I think that we should not forget how international law can be a language of persuasion and advocacy for peoples, for those who non-state actors, right, individuals, groups. And I hope that CIL Dialogue will also try to accommodate these diverse viewpoints.
Fantastic. Great point. All right, next. Dina.
I'm not sure I had thought of something really good, but thank you to Professor Ko, of course. And yeah, I think to me, this was a really revealing event about the need of a space like CIL Dialogues, and especially about the need to think about international law beyond the spaces where it traditionally takes place, be it geographical spaces or, as Wei Ling just said, actor-related spaces. So I think that's what I hope we manage to bring on the table, and I think we will all struggle to do so. Thank you.
I have no doubt. Next, should I call on Master? I'm going to give Martins last as editor-in-chief. So Martins,
sure, thank you very much.
And then Martins.
Thank you, Nilofer. Well, I suppose that I do not want to add anything to what has been said by Dina and Wei Ling. What I would say is more an appeal, really, to use us, basically, to send us pieces and to send us submissions, because that is what we're here for. The idea of CIL Dialogues is the one of giving a voice to also to people that perhaps haven't found a voice yet or haven't been able to express their voice in the fora that are existing at the particular moment, without anything detracting from what is going on in the other fora, of course. But yes, we're here to publish you and to work with you. So please do approach us. We're here. We'll be happy to work with you from now on.
Excellent. Stanley?
Yeah, so in addition to non-state actors, but also all the stakeholders in international law in our region, in Asia Pacific, from the global south and all around the world, what we have found that in making up our symposia, I guess there were people who communicated to me, practitioners of international law, international civil servants, who said, this is a great initiative and I would like to know more people from my own region who are, working in the same area, because everyone is working in their silo. So please write with us, publish with us, and then we form our community. Welcome.
Excellent, excellent. Last but not least, dear Martins is editor-in-chief.
Thank you, dear Nilofer. So I have 2 points. One point is how unfortunate it is that Nilofer has, with the current quinquennium, already finished the Jus Cogens articles, because otherwise we could add grandchildren to the annex as a truly peremptory norm of international law, which I think is very, very extremely inspiring. The second point is probably to bring all these things together. Our ambition is for CIL Dialogues to come to the mind of every international lawyer who is thinking of writing a blog post on universal or regional topic, particularly with an eye to Asia, but also other settings, that this would be one of the first 3 blogs that would come to your mind. Our vision statement sets out what we have there. I think, as you can see, we are in all conceivable ways a diverse editorial group. I was thinking of Philip Allett's famous statement that a treaty is disagreement reduced to writing. I think we may be disagreement reduced to an institution, so we are certainly not beholden to a particular perspective. Please write to us if you have bigger symposium ideas. There will be things coming out in the following weeks that will give you an idea of what we are thinking about. Please write on individual topics as well. We are not dogmatic. We are very happy to discuss these things. So hopefully we'll see more of you and we'll give an even louder voice to CIL on these matters. Many thanks.
Thank you so much. Tommy, did you want to say anything else before I close out?
No, thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. I have to say, I really feel we could have gone on. I thank the participants for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for Q&A, but I'll say this, our first symposium, it will be launched Monday, and it is basically climate change in an unequal world. Does international law matter? And we welcome you to tune in, Keep tuned in to CIL Dialogues, absolutely, and we welcome your contribution. And we really want to have a true discussion, all angles, and I think we've just mapped out the complexities of international law through CIL Dialogues. So thank you all, take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye.